Hello. We are starting today RIXC Art Science Festival called ECODATA, which is a collaboration with ECODATA, EcoMedia, EcoAesthetics, SNSF funded research project led by Yvonne Volkart. And also the speakers in this panel include Markus Mieder, who is also a researcher in this project, and myself. I was also a researcher. And then we have invited Kaisa Rissanen, a scientist who has been working also partly with me in this research project, which we would like you to introduce. And also our panel will be moderated by Felipe Castelblanco. Okay, so I give a word now to our moderator, and we start our panel.
Hello, everyone. I guess as far as I introduced, the panel is centered on the research ECODATA, which every speaker will elaborate on. I just want to give a few instructions in the order. Everyone will have a presentation of about 15 minutes. Then we will be asking questions, and these questions can be addressed in the chat, and I will read them out loud.
Vai viņi var atmutēt? Tur viss kārtībā? Jūs...
I think your microphone is still up.
Nē, viņiem visiem ir nomutēts. Viņi nevar neko izdarīt. Es teicu, ka visiem jābūt Markusam, viņš nevar atmutēt. Nu jā, tu... Bet es...
Oh, now it works and there was a hanger. You hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
No, there was something hanging. All right. Yes, I will share also my screen. Of the forest where we worked in the last years. I've been working there now since 8 years, and first we investigated the sounds of trees. That means the physiological sounds that the pine trees in that forest emit when they have drought stress. It was also a research project financed by the Swiss National Foundation, which was over in 2015. So for me, it was a big luck to go back to that forest that I already knew quite well, but to have a pretty different perspective on it by trying to observe the forest as a whole and not only single trees. So again, maybe the position of the forest, that's something you see here also from space. You've got here the Swiss mountains. And why is that place so dry in the Alps? That's maybe a question that arises, is because if you look at the satellite image here on the right, mostly in Switzerland the weather comes from the Atlantic, that means from the west, and since the Swiss mountains are very high on both sides of the valley, they not really often come over the mountains with rain and irrigation. They stop at the north side or at the south side, and that's the reason why this valley is so dry. That's here you see an image illustrating that. So while the rest of Switzerland has bad weather and rain, most of the days there's nice weather in Valais, which is very good to work for us, of course, but it causes a lot of trouble regarding droughts, even increasing periods of drought. That's something you see also here in that image. So you have huge areas in that valley that are really brown and dry. And if you look to the red flashes here, these are the positions where I placed automatic recorders. And maybe a short word about that. So my life has two parts. One part is the scientific, where I work as an acoustic ecologist, where I interpret environmental sounds in an ecological way. And the other part is my artistic work, and in most of the cases I try to bring these two disciplines together. So when I work as an acoustic ecologist, I mostly use automatic recorders that are placed somewhere in the landscape and that records over long time periods and intervals the soundscape of certain areas. That was my intention to do this at Keynote, and if you look at the positions of the recorders, they have quite huge distances in between. That means they are kilometers apart from each other, and that gives me the opportunity to observe an area, a whole landscape, which you would never hear at the same time. So with this recorder array, it's possible to listen to a landscape on a bigger scale actually. Here's the satellite image again, and maybe a word about the topography of Fiemwald, which is also pretty interesting. You've got here a mountain stream coming down from a deep valley, transports a lot of debris from the valley, and it's also a bigger part of Fiemwald which is growing on that delta from the mountain stream. So the place also where the WSL research station is mainly formed by this mountain stream here. And here you got also the big river in the valley, it's the Rhone River, and that part of Fiemwald, which is at the same time a natural reserve, that's also the part where the river flows freely. So you really got a wide landscape here, and Yvonne already showed steppe that is growing here close to the river. So the idea was to place these recorders in the forest, so that's how they look. Here's the area close to the mountain stream where I mounted one of the recorders. They got the microphone here at the side. They automatically can record now. In the case of our project, every 10 minutes they record 20 seconds. That's the site at the river. For me, it was important to select biotopes, different areas of that soundscape and landscape to get something like a holistic view on the field. So, of course, we wanted to be close to the river. That was one position of a recorder right here in this group of trees. Then another one was close to Ilgran. That's this mountain stream which looks pretty nice and harmless here, but can be look like this. Once there are heavy rains up there in the mountains, they come huge landslides down the river. And that's, for example, also something that you hear in my installation from time to time. One recorder was close to this pond here, also with a hydrophone. That's an underwater microphone in the pond for having like an idea about, okay, what is happening above water and below the water line, which was especially interesting once the frogs started to call in spring and you heard them through the air, their sounds, but also underwater, and these sounds are pretty different than the ones we normally hear. And as Simon already mentioned, drought is a big issue. Field, that's again the steppe area where a lot of trees died in the last year. And the crucial questions regarding this alpine ecosystem is how long these forests will exist in future, and maybe talking just about some years or decades until this forest has gone. There are new trees coming, like the downy oak, of course, from the Mediterranean area, but the question is how fast they can start to build a forest-like structure, or does climate change in an exponential way increase the droughts that no more forest will be there. That's an impressive graph I wanted to show you. It's not coming from our ECODATA project, it comes from the trees project where we listen to sounds of trees, but just to illustrate how the conditions are in this area. So on the top here, you got the temperature of the heat summer 2015, and here you got the dendrometer data. That means that that's the growth rate actually of the pine trees over there. You have to imagine the trees, they have a sensor on the branches or on the stem, and this sensor has a tip which is fixed to the surface of the bark, and this tip measures the fluctuations in the diameter of the branches and the bark. And each tree during daytime loses a lot of water during transpiration, and at nighttime it refills with water from the soil, and that produces these sine-like waves here. So each uprise is to refill at night, and going downwards is the loss of water at daytime. And what is really impressive with that particular tree here is that at the beginning of the growing season, in May, you see here the width of the stem, and at the end of the growth period, where the tree actually had to grow, it was smaller. The diameter of the tree was smaller. So that particular tree shrinked during the growth period. And of course, it's not the structure that shrunk, but it's the spot. And for comparison, there is another tree which is higher up, on a higher altitude, on a much more exposed spot than this one, because this tree is down in the forest, and this one is big up. And this is much better adapted to the drought than this one, which has normally enough water, but in the heat period of summer 2015 started to suffer from drought, especially here. The temperature rises up to 40 degrees, the tree really starts to shrink. And this one, actually not so much. Another graph is from the last 2 years I made from the 4 recorders, and there you see the difference. Here also a drought year. In the half of this graph is 2018, and the other half is 2019. And the blue lines going here over the whole spectrum are rain signals, mostly basically. And here you got the acoustic signals. That's a special index that we calculate called acoustic complexity index. So that means the diversity of sounds that we have in a landscape. And if you compare this diversity to the diversity in 2019, it's much lower because it was very hot and dry in this summer. And of course, all the noises go down in winter. That's because the animals aren't active in winter, and it comes back in 2019. So that means that's a very core of my research actually. What I do with acoustic recordings as a researcher, I observe also dynamics in biodiversity, for instance, because something like the acoustic complexity index is an indicator of the acoustic biodiversity of a soundscape. And by acoustic diversity, um, it's diversity of the sounds that we hear from animals, actually. All right. So for about Finwald, and maybe let's have a look to my work I did there. Let's just try to call up. Oh, flat screening is stopped. I need to go back to flat screening. We go here. So that's the virtual version of my installation that you will also see in the exhibition in the ECOM at the National Library. This version was made for the ZKM, the Center for Media and Arts in Karlsruhe. It's at the same time running now, the exhibition there. And what you see here, well, when I talk about drought, if you look to this panoramic image, it's not really drought. I took this image in spring, and it was one of the rare rainy days, so it was just one day there, and I had to take the panoramic image there. So that's how the day looks once it's raining. And you see these black panels here in the panoramic image, and these are at the same time the positions of the recorder. So once you scroll around in that online version, you hear the sounds of this particular area in the landscape. And now I switch the sound on. So here now the sounds of the pond that you saw in the image. And once you scroll towards the river, you hear the river. So maybe we go to a quieter area to explain you a little bit. What the idea was, or maybe also the discovery I made at Finwald during our research project, was that during the drought period of 2018, the landscape, the soundscape of Finwald changed, and it changed insofar dramatically because what happens when you have a drought period in a landscape or strong effects of climate change? A landscape gets quiet. Animals retire, the animals get quieter, mountain streams have less water. Other rivers, especially the Rhone River that you see here, has more water, so they produce more sound. So the soundscape is changing actually with effects, caused by effects of climate change, and that's something you hear in the installation. So, for instance, if we go to Ilgraben, the mountain stream I already showed you, is up here. So we hear now in springtime, that's something you see down here. So you hear the mountain stream, and you can switch here in that online version to summer. And there are much lower sounds of the mountain stream than in spring because it has less water. Now there was blood close to the microphone. And the opposite is at the river. So if you go back to spring and go to the border of the Rhone River, you hear the noises of the river. And if you switch to summer, it gets louder. So why the river gets louder in summer when it's dry and hot? That's just because the glaciers up here in the mountains are melting much more stronger and feed the river with much more water. So that's something you experience at one hand in my installation. At the other hand, you hear this strange sound like rolling around in the stereo image. And that's what I call the voice of the forest. That means that's a synthetically created voice meteorological data from the weather station from WSL to control the sound synthesis of these forest wars. And the parameters controlling that are air temperature, air humidity, light intensity, wind strength, and on. And now you hear the voices almost disappearing, and that's because you only hear the voice good enough when well enough when the conditions are good enough for the forest. So as good as the general climatic conditions are for the plants and the animals in the forest, the louder you hear that forest voice actually. So it's also like an experiment to try to give the important parameters for a forest or for life in general, to give that a voice, to give things that we cannot perceive normally acoustically, also some acoustic appearance. So that's for the installation. And the last thing I wanted to show you are the photographs you will also see in the exhibition, and as well as an introduction. When I worked there, I was wandering from one recorder to another, like getting the data from the SD cards, changing the batteries, and I always had a camera with me where I wanted to document things that I saw in the forest, maybe also traces of the changes in the forest. And of course, here again, we are at the borders of Ilgraben, of that mountain stream, and you see here these traces are, you see how strong that river can really form and change a landscape once it comes to extreme weather events. So it's not only drought in that area that has a huge influence on the shape of the landscape, it's also extreme weather events like heavy rains, for instance. That's the highway which is going through, crossing Fiewald, and this highway will also, and this highway will also change the landscape dramatically in the next years because they will rebuild the highway, make it bigger, and for that purpose there will be a huge construction site in the next years. And that's just the beginning of that construction site. Then at some places I got also camera traps. From time to time see animals there. And here we see their rabbit at night. That's also, these are traces of the research going on in the European forest at the research station, traces of scientists. And that's also the reason why I installed this camera trap, because of course, I wanted to know when the researchers are working there for being able to identify like human activity on the spot where my recorders are, but just ask them to write me once they go to the station, but nobody did. So I installed a camera trap to know when people have been there, because when the camera makes a photo, you see also the date, and so I was informed on human activity at the research site. Here, that's one thing local people call the Pac-Man. That was a huge forest fire close to Loic, up the mountain, and it really has the shape of the Pac-Man symbol in the landscape. Of course, we got a lot of parasites in the forest, caused also by a lower resistance of the trees against these bark beetles, but also mistletoes. Almost every tree there has mistletoes on it, which is a sign that it's already the resistance is already pretty weak of the tree.
Marcus.
Yes.
Your time is up. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, but I think that's a good end because that's the last thing I wanted to show. So thank you for your attention. And we stop. Presentation, and that's it.
No? Yeah, okay. Felipe now next door. No, yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I think we continue. Thank you, Marcus, for this. well, in the order, I think we will continue, if this is okay with Kaisa, in the schedule. That's what we have, right? Which basically, I will very briefly introduce Kaisa, because I think time is precious and we're running out of it. So Kaisa Reisen, sorry, Lisa Wisnen, and I'm really sorry if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly. So postdoctoral researcher at the University of Quebec, Montreal. It's also Doctor of Science from the Faculty of Agriculture and Forestry at the University of Helsinki. Has been engaged in research at that concentrated in the relationships between physiology, the resin, and the emissions of volatile organic components in the Scots pine. She has conducted research in the Finfall forest, and well, will share with us her thoughts on the type of emissions and the type of activity that happens in the forest above the ground.
Thank you, and I will also share screen. Okay. So thank you very much for the kind introduction, and good afternoon for everybody. I'm really excited to be a part of this festival, and so thank you for inviting me. And as Felipe said, my talk is going to be about the volatile emissions from trees, from forests, and why they are such interesting topic at the moment in the forest research. And I'm going to also present shortly the research campaign that I did also in the Finwald forest in 2018, and which was also involved in Gaza's artwork that she will be talking about. So, now I shortly invite you to look at this figure, this image, and think about what you might smell, what kind of odors you might get from the pine needles or from a warm updraft from the forest floor. I suppose that's pretty familiar for all of us. Now, these odors that you might imagine, they look, if you draw them a chemical representation, they look more or less like that. So they are what we call volatile organic compounds. We have many different kinds of those. So what I draw here is, for example, I hope you can see what we have, for example, isoprene, we have tricarine, and then we have alpha and beta pinene. And how much of these compounds are released from the forests and which compounds they actually are, that depends largely on the plant species they are in the forest and on the environmental conditions. And here I'm going to concentrate mainly on compound group that is called monoterpenes, which are the main compounds emitted from pine trees and from conifer trees in general. And for example, these beta and alpha pinene that are here in the corner, they are the major components that are emitted exactly in Finland. Now I promised to tell why these are an interesting topic at the moment, and I'm just briefly going to go through that. So for one, these compounds are really important in the defense of trees. As Markus was saying, these trees in Finland are suffering from different parasites and bark beetles, and these volatile organic compounds are helping the trees to mitigate these stresses. So for example, they can be deterrent or toxic to herbivores or bark beetles, and they can help the trees to survive heat stress or too high irradiation. Secondly, they are also part of this complexity and interconnections within the ecosystem. So they can be used as signals, not only within one tree, but also between different trees. And also these herbivores and the parasites and predators of herbivores can use these compounds as signals to find suitable prey or suitable host. And thirdly, they are also important from a more urgent point of view because they have effects on the atmospheric chemistry and they affect many processes in the atmosphere. And I'm going to talk about that a little more. So one of the complex processes that these compounds take part in is that they participate in the growth of atmospheric particles, which are here represented by these gray dots. And once these particles grow big enough, water vapor can condense around them, which means that they can work as cloud condensation nuclei. So the emissions of these volatile compounds can ultimately affect cloudiness, which means that they can affect also the radiation that reaches the Earth's surface and precipitation patterns. In clean air, these compounds also react with ozone, and ozone is a phytotoxin. It's harmful for humans, animals, and for plants. But if we have an atmosphere that's already polluted, these same compounds can react with the pollutants and increase the concentration of ozone and increase the concentration of particulate matter. And these two together create these smog situations in big cities. So the combinations of large emissions, large biogenic emissions of these volatiles, and then highly polluted atmosphere will be quite harmful. And this is where we need to be careful when thinking about the expanding the amount of forests near industrial or big cities. So to better understand the effect of these volatiles in the atmosphere and in the ecosystem, and to better model the future atmosphere and atmosphere right now, and the effects on climate change, the effect on the global warming, and to understand whether these different processes and feedbacks have a net cooling effect or maybe a net warming effect. We need to really understand the emissions of these compounds from different ecosystems. For example, we know more or less a lot from the temperate forest or boreal forests, but there is still a lot to learn about the tropical forests or even wetland forests. And we need to understand the different sources of these compounds within one ecosystem. And one source that we really haven't studied a lot is the stem of the trees, because we usually consider tree stem as this passive kind of inert part, which is just for transporting materials, and then the interesting part is the canopy from the point of view of the volatiles. But in this research that I'm going to show you and that I did in Finland, we were actually looking into the stem to see if it matters and should we take it into account when estimating total volatile emissions for forests. So we go back to Finland that you have already seen in many photos, and this time this is the 2018 summer campaign of measuring volatile emissions from the pine stems. So this research was a continuation of my doctoral thesis work, and this part of the work I did in collaboration with the WSL scientists in the Finwald forest, where we installed these plastic chambers around the tree stems and a whole lot of tubing and more tubing and meters of tubing that went through different regulators through the instrument that you see in this left corner. which is called proton transfer reaction mass spectrometer. So it is a gas analyzer that was analyzing constantly the this is the part where I like first time actually I can smell the emissions, but I never see them until I get this graph from the measuring computer. And here each colorful line is a different mass of a compound, a different molecular mass, and each of these peaks is when I close the chamber and start to draw air from the chamber to the instrument. So let's analyze this data and see what it gives. The first finding that we had from this forest was that there were actually a lots and lots of these monoterpids coming from the Scots pine stems, which should not be surprising in the sense that the conifer trees, especially pines, contain a huge amount of resin within the stem. And this resin is 1/4 composed of these exact monoterpids. So when they escape from the resin storages, they cause big emissions of monoterpids to the air.
We have 4 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Now, the second finding was that we were interested in seeing how the drought affects these emissions, since we were in these drought-prone forests. And we saw that when there is a lot of water in the soil, when the soil water potential is close to zero, there are more emissions, but when the soil water content decreases, the emissions decrease from the stems. But there was also these surprise peaks of huge emissions in the end of summer, even though there was very little water available in the soil. So these we suspected that may have to do with these herbivory or parasites, some biogenic stress that we just didn't see but was existing, and that caused the trees to try to defend themselves and push out lots of these monoterpids. I'm going to conclude with this, and the conclusion from this study for now is that yes, actually the tree stems can be important sources of these volatile compounds, and which is actually really nicely illustrated in Rasa's work, that even this part of the tree that we usually find a bit of passive part has a lot going on within and around it. And also that even though we think something, we shouldn't always believe that, and next time we walk in the forest, let's just let our noses to lead the way rather than the brain. Thank you. Wait, how I close this? Like this? Here.
Atmetījiet Filipi.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, we have the issue of muted microphones. Well, thank you, Kaisa, for such a nice presentation. We are in this really nice flow entering into this forest, so I think it's a precise, almost setting the ground for Rasa's team, who will continue
Mani tagad, ja?
introduction. But in this case, we're gonna now basically listen to her presentation and her work, which relates very much to Kaisa's research. Please, Rasa, have the floor.
Okay. Hier.
Have the floor.
Okay. Hier. Okay. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Kaisa. My talk, and I will be now sharing the screen and introducing my talk. Is it okay? Yeah. View full screen. Okay, first of all, I would like to actually thank you, Yvonne, for inviting me to join this amazing project, because it has been an absolutely invaluable journey through all those 3 years since ECODATA at the beginning. And this also refers to my field trips to Finland, where I just went there a couple of times trying to feedbacks. It's never problem. And I'm sorry, but it's a bit big stuff.
To me was the idea of care, whereas it was first important to me to scrutinize and maybe also criticize the adoption of, or the enthusiasm about techno-ecologies and eco-media. It became clear to me during the process that it's also important to think about humans' impact and humans' behavior, humans' methods. So the term care became important, and it became just now more important through Corona. It's very interesting to see that. So, because for me it was important to think about care that goes beyond the idea of getting sensibility and in relation to the more human. I meant that I'm really affected as a caregiver, as a mother to say, as being somebody that cares for the oikos, for the household, but not in this narrow sense, but in this terrestric sense. So in German, for example, care means trouble, concern, as well as caring. It has a double meaning. So ecology and the aesthetics of ecology is about specific relations with entities, even with those who I do not know. It is about transformation, about becoming, about the joy of becoming. It is a surplus and excess, about experience to be part of an evolving world in becoming. It is against human subjectification as homo economicus, whose actions mean exploitation of the other, of which I do not feel to be part of. So I try to explain this a little bit with respect first to Marcus' work. In his installation, we heard a synthetic low and high sound, which could be a virtual voice, but in fact it is not a voice. At least it has neither something human, nor does it say anything. So Marcus said, in a certain sense, it's the voice of the forest. So that's maybe something we can ask. How can we really develop as an artist the voice of the forest, or is this already a takeover, a representation of something that is difficult? I have been talking about that with other people who feared that it could be like that. But my impression is that in this work, this does not happen. This sound which we hear has something really sets something really free. And there's an indeterminacy of the who speaks. It's not completely clear that it is really the forest speaking. So it leads to a permanent tension that does not dissolve. Rather, the viewer feels. I think it's more about the feeling that the forest represented here, which she hears and sees and feels, especially in this immersive installation, is a body, a living being. And this, I think, is very important, that forest can be felt as a living being, like a body. That she moves in its terror, she is affected by its mystery. Although Perimeter Filmwald manages these sound locations entirely without narrations and aesthetically reminiscent of the information design of the sciences of pedagogy, the atmosphere has something musical about it. It's recalling natural religion in which the forest is not an outside of the body. At the same time, the artificiality of the sound, the voice makes us think of a cyborg, of something hybrid. The forest being, the forest body, the forest here is nature culture and something that is set free, as I said before. The second work is Rasa's work. She developed, as she told us, a VR installation as well as a performance. Her atmospheric forest is dedicated to the phenomenon that pines not only convert CO2 into oxygen, as is generally known, but that they also produce volatile gases and emit CO2. In times of climate change, this phenomenon seems to increase, but how the interplay works in detail and what role soil, water and other plants play cannot be fully explained. So her work, in a certain sense, immerses us into this mystery. And this VR installation too lets us immerse into a forest so that we can experience forest as an organism. This is very interesting here that we couldn't see it because it was animated, but if we are in the animation, exactly also this sentence over all the trees and soil are breathing is something we can experience. And then we can also see that the animation of this data is making the trees like chimneys. And but it's also something like a dance. The trees are machines, organisms, crazed constellations, breathing beings that are frighteningly alive. We experience them as alien things that we do not longer understand on the one hand, and on the other, we share with them this breathing, which is something totally existential to all organisms. So, it is something we share with the modern human world, which humans share with more than human. It's alien and not alien, so that's the interesting thing, and this is also a similar experience we made in the installation of Marcus. In summary, it can be said that Rasa's Mitte and Marcus Meller's approach the Filmwald by means of different sensing techniques, which are both old and new, digital and analog. They use representations such as photography, well as manual techniques. All of these representations are used in the sciences as well as in the arts and consumer areas. Of the technosciences, as well as with artistic aesthetics of surprise and the former may be owed to the epistemological claim of artistic researchers to say something fundamental about climate change. It signals that there are common concerns between technoscience and art, concerns of social relevance, but it also makes it clear what the reality-defining effect the technosciences and their sensing technologies have on our constructions of nature and the world. While they meticulously record the changes on planet Earth, they transform it into a program Earth, as Jennifer Gabriel said, a closely interwoven test field. Program and laboratory. And I mean, I wanted to end, or I wanted to open up my statement also into the next panel, because in a certain sense, both Rasas Mythe and Marcus Mather, although they let us experience forest as an organism and body, they are not so much concerned about these technologies of caring. Although the effect of the experience with the installations is that I begin to care about what is here and about this complexity and so on. But they do not, it's not so much about technologies of care. And this is what I wanted to end with. I wanted to open into two other works. First, it's Ursula Biemann's work, Acoustic Ocean, in which we see a woman, half scientist, half marine being, who tries in a certain sense to use her technologies to install a communication between humans, marine beings, and air beings. So that's there a little bit the narration which she does with the video, and another narration here we have in a email or WhatsApp. It was a WhatsApp communication between Lena and Ola Valkeapää in her slide, in her video video manifestations, which is also an example which we can see in the next panel. It is a manifestation of a relating mother. It is about a caring eco-manliness, which we can see adopts several techniques of sensing. So to end this, I want to say that we have there Lapland. We see the rising sun in front of a white snowy landscape. At home, one hears a voice saying in Finnish. A few pictures further, a dog on a snowmobile watching the sunset. Again and again, these pictures of the dog on the machine looking into the landscape. A herding dog who is there observing, working. The 16-minute video meditation manifestations tells of life with reindeer. It is also the life of the artist, the partner of Sami reindeer herder Ola. The video consists of a quiet sequence of photos and synchronized text messages that Ola has sent her over the course of a year. Life is stressful and is determined by the constant care for the animals. Quotation: from a distance, I look at my little ones. What are they doing right now? I try to understand, to interpret. he writes. The tenderness of his works, his pictures make it clear that it is precisely in this constant relating to his loved ones that gives him fulfillment and joy. Quotation, the reindeer seem happy, so am I. Descartes' cogito ergo sum is here in a version that is creaturely connected to the world. This vast landscape in white, as much as it touches the limits of humanity, it is animated and speaking. Ola hardly ever speaks as an I, as always a we, an encounter, with tracks in the snow, with young foxes, with water in summer, and so on. So I really need to finish now, and maybe also with this last sentence. Manifestations presents the life of indigenous subsistence farming made impossible in the Anthropocene as still possible, even as a good life that brings joy. The mother of the animals, their guardian, is an invisible man, perceptible only through the forms of relationships and cooperation he establishes. All the artistic practices presented here do not play off the ecological against the technological. In their relational simultaneity, they cross the polarity of the relations of violence itself and open themselves as a felt, lived care. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ron. This was a really great conclusion to the panel, and it leaves so many questions opened. So I guess I just have to keep a check on time. We have about 9 minutes to close with a few questions in order to give, to not push this panel further. I want to ask an initial question, and I also invite people to write their questions, but that precisely that you mentioned, that how can this work makes us care? And when I say us, I think we want to, for example, address this question to Kaisa, for people who are in these fields that might not look at the work of artists in order to inform the research, but I really want to ask Kaisa, how does this work make you care? And if it makes you care in a slightly different way than what is possible from your tools, from your discipline. How does this work, for example, Rasa or Marcus's work, or Yvonne's questions, feed back into the type of research that scientists are doing in the forest, for example?
Yes, I think this kind of work is really inspiring for many people. If we talk about now how inspired scientists is that we rarely see our work in such a kind of tangible manner. We only see numbers on a spreadsheet or some kind of figures, but when we see actually kind of the forest coming alive and seeing the intercomplexity with our eyes, which are for humans still mainly the most important sense, it's really inspiring, and it makes us to ask more questions and maybe find more questions that need to be answered. And sometimes with really weird connections. I really like Yata's artwork, the phases when we go inside the tree and then we go up like in chimney, as Yvonne said, and that reminded me of how, especially in the start of my career, I desperately just wanted to see inside the tree because I didn't understand what was going on inside there. So these kind of just connections to some other things that we were thinking about earlier might bring up a new idea and new ways of thinking that are important for the creative work of scientists too.
Thank you. That's, I mean, it's so interesting to for example, that image of entering the tree. And you also mentioned that you could smell, but until it was not rendered by the computer, you couldn't see it. And I think I'm really interested in that relationship, because even though we're sentient beings, it seems like computers' data still needs to be there to justify what we already perceive. And for example, a question for Marcus or Rasa, maybe Marcus to start with, how does data plays in, for example, you as a sentient being already, you listened, you walk through the forest, but also you kind of have to mediate between sonifying something, dealing with data in order to produce more data, thinking of sound as synthesis, versus what you actually listen to. How do you negotiate these two sides of your work, for example?
Well, in my case, I would say for me, what astonishes me myself sometimes in my work with acoustic means in general is that on the level of sound or listening, you create always a certain intimacy. That means an acoustic experience of something takes you generally closer to the object of your investigation, but also the object of for a visitor that meets an exhibition. So I think through, especially by sound, you can help people to immerse into something they maybe just saw or heard briefly of a certain area. That's one thing. But the other thing I think there are also always two parts, especially when scientists and artists work together. So, of course, as an artist, you create some kind of fictional narration of something that is maybe very real, like a natural environment. But I find it always important to feed that by scientific facts. So not only, not really in a way of communicating science, because that's what I not do. I don't really produce something like science communication, but that's an aspect of it. So I think this combination of scientific knowledge and artistic narration creates, in some cases, or is able to create something like a holistic view on phenomena that we meet in the natural environment.
Yeah, that's actually that. I'm just gonna kind of stay with that last sentence, that the narration of the work, because it also narrates a process. And this is something that I, for example, see in Rasa's work with the performance, not just the visualization, but you didn't go so much into the performance, but that is really interesting, because you are not only visualizing a process, but you're kind of enacting a process. You're playing kind of the chemist or the alchemist. Also, you're maybe borrowing from other knowledges. And in that case, yeah, my question was at what point produce the performance in the research, and how did you came back from that performance back to the visualization, back to the data that you were dealing with?
Okay, so first of all, what I would like also, after me, give a bit back a floor to Yvonne to say what she's meaning when she says technologies of caring. Yeah, is it approach of caring or what? But what I would like to emphasize, what is, and then I will answer to your question, Felipe. What is very specific, maybe in my and also Marcus' work, actually, if you compare Yvonne with Ursula's or Lena's work, is because we are more focused on our experience. Then we use data to constitute actually another environment which also could deliver this experience. But what we don't do, this is not, we are more using, so in terms of this, because we work with data and technologies, we more use like a sociological approach, sociological methodology to create these stories and image. While Ursula and Lena, they do use an anthropological approach. So really like connected to the peoples and community, even mystical or speculative or fictional stories. Our stories are actually made by data. I'm not really talking because I see very similar approach also in Marcus. For me, it was probably not enough. For Marcus, maybe it was enough because he worked with sound. So this already by itself is a very unique and specific medium. I love the sound because it immerses you immediately in the particular environment. But for me, it was not enough just to have a data from the volatiles. I really wanted to put my hands on something physically because I'm an artist. I need this tangibility with the material. And there is still a lot of where to go. But I were particularly interested in these transformations because when scientists at VSL Institute tried me to explain that this is kind of almost the same molecular consistence, just one is lower molecules, the other one are more, like higher, those who are volatile, and the turpentine is almost the same as resin in terms of formula. For me, it seemed very exciting, and if I really could transform, I started to become a do-it-yourself alchemist. I was trying to search through different methods how I could transform it myself, really to experience, and I was so super happy after 4.5 hours of these experiments that it all worked out, that I've got colophonium and I really got the drops of turpentine. Yeah. So maybe for Kaisa, so can you a bit explain what did I achieve with these experiments? Is it somehow representing the volatile emissions?
Yes, it was actually, I checked that narrative and I was really excited about that too, because it's in a sense something that I also did, but just in a lab and with the tubes and warming the resin up and trying to measure things. But yeah, I really understand your need to get your hands on something. I'm similar in that sense. So what you were doing is you were separating the volatiles that are like small molecules that easily escape from the resin, and then the big molecules that are heavy and that stay in a solid or liquid form. And this is actually an important process in the pine trees, because that's how they are going to seal any wounds on the tree surface. So let's say there is an insect that bores into the tree bark and the resin starts to spill out. And when the resin spills out, these volatile, really small molecules that you were able to extract, they evaporate and they disappear. And what's left is then this hard surface that we can see actually as these resin droplets sometimes on the tree surface. So that was, for me, that was the processes that you were actually reproducing.
Yvonne, please.
Yeah, I want to come back to what Rasa asked. Yvonne, what do you understand under this technology, with these technologies of care? So what may be the difference? I found interesting what you said, and I would confirm that. But I try to have another perspective. I would say technologies of care is when I see that you use something to take care for something. So in your performance, for example, I would say that you care for the process of making of transforming this resin into these volatiles. So you take care of this whole event of transformation from some substance into the other. So, and I can see it. You are, as a human being, in the middle part of this, and you take care for all these different events which will come out of this. But in the VR installation, I cannot see this. It's not. It doesn't have to be something. It's not a question of quality or so. It doesn't. It's not a criticism. It's only that in the performance, I can perceive this care for the event, and in the VR installation is the providing of this experience to the audience, and the same with Marcus. So I cannot I know how he did it, and I know that he cared totally for all these microphones and so on, but directly I cannot see it in the installation. That's maybe the difference, what I mean.
So I think we are reaching very soon the end of the panel, but I think that's a really important image to stay with, which is the caring, the process, and just maybe a tiny simple question, Yvonne, but when we talk about this techno care as it only relates to data, but you also brought at the end, towards the end, the question of the past, indigenous, the experience, the old. Can this data, can we start looking at more broadly at data and think of experience as data, accumulated type of data? Or you still want to remain in the more digitized, in the more archival type of data?
I don't know if I answer your question correctly, but I think using data and technology, at the end it's just a tool. It's just a tool to gain a certain goal. And I guess regarding acoustics, for instance, there's a lot of technology behind the possibility to hear a tree, for instance. A lot of specialized devices. But in the end, what counts is if someone puts a headphone on and realizes it's alive. And I think that's a very basic experience. And I think at the same time, it's a very artificial experience because it's created artificially. But I think that's how our narrations of the environment function. So we need to tell us some sort of story about the environment, and nowadays, of course, it's created by technological means. So even a scientist creates some sort of narration of the environment. Artists maybe do that a bit differently, but behind there's always any kind of technological machinery to create such narrations. That be just a pen and a paper to write it on it.
Yes, and these machines, they have a certain aesthetics. I mean, just brought by them. And there are limits what you can create and what you cannot. And that's why these tangible experiences for me was probably quite new also. I've done, well, we've done not very new actually, with also with bacteria battery. We did really, for us most exciting was actually to go to make workshops to collect the mud together with the workshop participants, to go to find some pond and take this physical material. Yeah, okay, and then it helps us to understand and imagine and be really fascinated by other processes like electricity generation or these volatile emissions like atmosphere chemistry, because these tangible materials help to understand them. And other means like VR or sound, like installations or sonifications, like in Marcus' case. Yeah, they are creating this environment in which we then bring the viewer, how we share our experience. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everyone. Let's stay with us. Last sentence: experience, sharing experience. So I think we're coming to the end of the panel. The program continues. So thank you, everyone, for participating.